The scratching began again at 1:30 in the narrow house on Cock Lane, where the timber beams pressed close and the winter cold seeped through every crack in the plaster. The child lay rigid beneath her blankets. Her father sat at the edge of the bed, his hand trembling as he held the candle higher. The flame cast long shadows across the walls of the cramped chamber, and in those shadows something seemed to move with purpose. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It came from within the wainscoting, deliberate and rhythmic, as if answering questions no one had yet dared to ask. The girl, Elizabeth, 11 years old, her face pale as churchyard marble, did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, though her lips moved in silent prayer. Around the bed, neighbours had gathered, their breath fogging in the frigid air. They had come from Smithfield, from Holborn, from as far as Clerkenwell, drawn by whispers that had spread through the parish like fever. A woman was dead, a young woman taken suddenly in the night, her body barely cold in the ground at St. John's. And now, they said, she had returned, not in flesh but in sound, not to comfort, but to accuse. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if the very bones of the house were speaking. And in the year of our Lord 1762, in the heart of Georgian London, where reason and enlightenment claimed dominion over superstition, no one present could deny what their ears told them was true. Something was trying to be heard. Chapter 1. The House on Cock Lane. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, the world grown small and still around you. Wherever you are listening, perhaps in bed with the lamp turned low, or in some quiet corner where the day has finally released its hold, you have found sanctuary here. What time is it where you rest? Is it the deep of night, or that strange hour before dawn when the world feels suspended between darkness and light? Before we begin our journey into the past, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. These stories, drawn from the shadows of history, take many hours to research and craft. Your subscription helps this work continue, helps these forgotten voices reach more listeners who, like you, find comfort in the company of the past. And if this tale moves you, if it helps you drift towards sleep or simply keeps you company in the quiet hours, please leave a like on this video. It helps more than you might imagine, pushing these stories out into the world where they belong. Now, let us drift backward through time. Let the present fall away like autumn leaves. Let the noise and hurry of your day fade into memory. Tonight we travel to London. Not the London you might know, but the London of 1762, where the streets were lit by oil lamps, where the Thames ran thick with the commerce of empire, and where the line between the living and the dead was not yet drawn by science, but by faith, fear, and the testimony of those who swore they had heard the impossible. Close your eyes if you wish. Listen only to the rhythm of these words. We are going to a narrow street, to a house where something occurred that would shake the certainty of an age, a haunting, a mystery, a scandal that began with scratching in the walls and ended in a courtroom where truth itself stood trial. Let us begin. Cock Lane ran north from Smithfield Market, a cramped artery of timber and brick that wound its way through the parish of St. Sepulchre. In the winter of 1761 it was neither fashionable nor destitute, but occupied that uncertain territory between respectability and ruin that characterised so much of Georgian London. The houses pressed close together, their upper stories jutting over the cobblestones so that neighbours could nearly touch hands across the narrow gap. The smell of Smithfield, blood and offal and animal fear, drifted up on certain winds, mingling with coal smoke and the sour tang of the Fleet Ditch that ran its fetid course not far to the east. The house that would become famous stood on the western side of the lane, 3 stories of blackened timber and crumbling plaster that leaned slightly toward the street, as if weary of standing upright. It belonged to Richard Parsons, a man whose station in life could be measured by the calculations of shillings and the weight of small debts. He worked as a clerk to the parish, keeping records of births and deaths and marriages, his quill scratching figures into ledgers by candlelight, his eyes growing weak from the strain of accounting for other people's lives while his own remained perpetually one misfortune away from collapse. Parsons had taken lodgers to supplement his income, as was common among those who owned property but possessed little ready money. The rooms he let were on the upper floor, modest chambers with low ceilings and small windows that admitted only thin London light. His wife attended to the household with the grim efficiency of a woman who had learned to make much from little. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was 11 years old in that winter, a pale child with dark eyes who helped her mother with the washing and the cooking, and who slept in a small room adjacent to the lodgers' chambers, separated only by a thin wall of lath and plaster. The street outside carried the sound of daily commerce. Costermongers called their wares from morning until dusk. Carts rattled over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of traffic. Church bells from St. Sepulchre tolled the hours, and sometimes when the wind came from the south, one could hear the great bell of St. Paul's adding its voice to the city's constant song. This was London as it had been for generations, layered, crowded, alive with the business of survival and the small dramas that consumed ordinary lives. In such a place, in such a house, nothing remarkable should have occurred. Richard Parsons was not a man given to flights of fancy. His wife possessed no reputation for hysteria or imagination. Their daughter was by all accounts an ordinary child, neither particularly clever nor particularly dull, raised in the manner of her class to be useful and quiet and obedient. They were in every respect unremarkable. But in January of 1761, when the days were short and the cold penetrated even the thickest walls, William Kent came to inquire about rooms. Kent was a man of middling age, perhaps 40 years, with the bearing of someone who had known better circumstances. He dressed respectably, spoke with the educated accent of the commercial class, and carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to conducting business in the city's counting-houses. He worked as a clerk, though at a higher station than Parsons. His position with a stockbroker in the exchange afforded him a decent income and the expectation of further advancement. When he arrived at the house on Cock Lane, he explained that he required lodging for himself and for a woman who accompanied him. The woman's name was Frances Lynes, though she was called Fanny by those who knew her. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23 years, and possessed the kind of beauty that drew attention even in a city filled with beautiful women. Her features were delicate, her manner gentle and refined. She wore mourning, the black crape of recent bereavement, and she spoke little during that first visit, allowing Kent to negotiate the terms of their lodging, while she stood quietly at his side. Parsons asked no questions about the nature of their relationship. In London, one learned not to inquire too closely into the arrangements of others, particularly when rent was needed and the room stood empty. Kent paid a month in advance. The coins counted out onto Parsons's table in good silver, and the matter was settled. They would take possession of the upstairs chambers immediately. What Parsons did not know, what Kent chose not to reveal, was that Frances Lynes was not his wife. She could not be his wife. She had been married to Kent's brother, and when that brother died, she had inherited a modest sum that would pass to William only upon their marriage. But English law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The prohibition was absolute, rooted in scripture and reinforced by statute. And so they lived as husband and wife without benefit of clergy, without legal sanction, their union recognised in private affection but condemned by public morality. They kept this secret well. To the Parsons family and to the neighbours on Cock Lane, they presented themselves as a respectable couple temporarily displaced, while they searched for more permanent accommodation. Kent went daily to his work at the exchange. Fanny occupied herself with needlework and reading, her condition limiting her movements as its months progressed. For she was with child, her body swelling with the evidence of their union. The baby expected to arrive in the early days of February. The winter deepened. Frost formed on the inside of windows. The Thames froze at its edges, and vendors set up stalls on the ice, selling hot pies and gin to those who ventured onto the frozen river. In the house on Cock Lane, The Parsons family went about their business while above them the lodgers maintained their quiet domesticity. Elizabeth sometimes heard them moving about in the evening, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of conversation, the soft sounds of two people sharing a space, and sometimes late at night when the house had settled into darkness, she heard other sounds, small sounds, scratching sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. She mentioned them once to her mother, who told her it was mice or rats, the inevitable companions of any London dwelling. The child accepted this explanation and thought little more about it, but the sounds continued, and as January gave way to February, as Fanny's time drew near and the household prepared for the upheaval of childbirth, those small scratching sounds began to change. They grew louder, more deliberate, more insistent, as if whatever made them sought not merely to exist in the walls, but to communicate through them. No one yet understood what was beginning. No one could have predicted that this house, this unremarkable dwelling on an unremarkable street, would soon become the most famous address in all of London, that thousands would come to stand outside its door, that men of science and men of faith would argue over what occurred within its walls, that the events set in motion during that cold winter would culminate in scandal, in trial, in the destruction of reputations and the questioning of certainties that had stood for generations. For now, in those final days of January 1761, the house on Cock Lane was simply a house. Richard Parsons kept his accounts, his wife tended her household, Elizabeth slept in her small room with the thin walls, and upstairs William Kent and Fanny Lynes waited for the child that would soon arrive, unaware that Fanny herself had less than 2 weeks to live. The scratching in the walls continued through the nights, patient and persistent, as if something that had long been silent had finally found its voice. Chapter 2. The Lodger and His Lady. William Kent had come to London as so many did, drawn by the promise of fortune that seemed to shimmer above the city like heat rising from summer cobblestones. He had been born in Norfolk, the son of a publican, and had shown early aptitude for numbers and letters. His family had scraped together enough to apprentice him to a merchant, and from there he had risen through the commercial ranks with the steady determination of a man who understood that birth mattered less in the city than ability and opportunity. By the time he had reached his 4th decade, Kent had secured a position with a stockbroker near the Royal Exchange, that great hub of empire where fortunes were made and lost with the arrival of each ship from the Indies or the Americas. He kept ledgers, managed accounts, and carried himself with the dignity of a man who dealt daily with sums that could feed a family for years. His rooms were decent, his clothing respectable, his prospects solid. He lacked only one thing that might have completed his ascent into comfortable respectability: a wife. He had been married once, briefly, in his youth. That union had produced no children, and had ended with his wife's death from smallpox. He had not sought to remarry, finding in his work sufficient occupation, and in the company of other merchants sufficient society. But in 1759 his brother John had died suddenly, leaving behind a young widow and a modest inheritance that included the lease on a public house in Lynham. The widow was Frances Lynes, called Fanny, the daughter of a Lynham innkeeper who had given her to John Kent in marriage when she was barely 18. She had been a good wife by all accounts, attending to the business of the public house with competence, keeping the accounts in a neat hand, supervising the serving girls and ensuring that the customers were fed and watered without incident. When John Kent collapsed one evening behind his own bar, dead of an apoplexy before the surgeon could be summoned, Fanny found herself a widow at 20 years old with a modest income and no clear path forward. William Kent had travelled to Lynham to settle his brother's affairs. He found Fanny in mourning, pale and quiet in her widow's weeds, managing the public house with a calm efficiency that impressed him. They spoke of business matters, the lease, the inventory, the debts that needed settling. He stayed several days, longer than strictly necessary, and during those days he found himself drawn to this young woman who bore her grief with such dignity. She was not learned in the manner of ladies of higher station. She had not been taught music or French or the ornamental accomplishments that mark genteel education, But she could read and write, she understood accounts, and she possessed a natural grace that needed no instruction. More than this, she seemed genuinely pleased by his company, listening when he spoke of London and the Exchange, asking intelligent questions about the world beyond Lynham. Before he returned to the city, William Kent had made Fanny an offer. Not of marriage, that was forbidden by law, the prohibition against marrying one's brother's widow being absolute and ancient. But he proposed that she might come to London, that they might live as husband and wife in all but name, that her inheritance might be combined with his income to provide them both with comfort and security. He painted a picture of a life in the great city, of theatres and pleasure gardens, of a world larger and more exciting than anything Lynham could offer. Fanny accepted. Perhaps she was lonely. Perhaps she was practical, understanding that a young widow's prospects in a small town were limited. Perhaps she simply believed William Kent when he told her he loved her. Whatever her reasons, she settled her affairs in Lynham, packed her belongings into a trunk, and travelled to London in the autumn of 1760. They could not live openly as man and wife. The law forbade their union, and while London was large enough to hide many irregular arrangements, they were not wealthy enough to live in complete privacy. They took rooms in various houses, presenting themselves as a married couple, Kent using his business connections to secure lodgings where questions would not be asked. For a time they lived near Chancery Lane, then for several months in rooms off Holborn. Fanny adapted to city life with the same quiet competence she had brought to managing a public house. She kept their rooms tidy, she marketed for provisions, she occupied herself with needlework and reading when Kent was at his work. In the evenings they would sometimes walk to the Vauxhall Gardens when the weather permitted, or attend a play at Drury Lane, sitting in the upper gallery among the tradesmen and their wives. They were, to all outward appearances, an ordinary couple of the middling sort, neither rich nor poor, making their way in a city that contained multitudes. In the summer of 1760, Fanny discovered she was with child. The news brought both joy and complication. A child would be visible evidence of their union, would make their irregular situation more difficult to conceal. But Kent was pleased. He spoke of the child as if it would make their arrangement more permanent, more real, as if the presence of an infant might somehow sanctify what the law condemned. As Fanny's condition advanced, Kent determined they should find new lodgings. Their rooms near Holborn were not suitable for a woman in her confinement, and the landlady there had begun to ask questions that suggested she suspected the truth of their situation. Kent made inquiries through his business associates and was directed to Richard Parsons on Cock Lane, who had rooms to let and was known to be discreet in his dealings. They arrived at the house in early January of 1761, when Fanny was perhaps 6 months gone with the child. The rooms Parsons showed them were modest but clean, 2 chambers on the upper floor with a small fireplace and windows that looked out over the lane. The rent was reasonable. More importantly, Parsons asked no uncomfortable questions about marriage lines or parish registrations. Kent paid a month in advance, and they moved their belongings up the narrow stairs. Fanny took to the new lodgings with her characteristic quiet efficiency. She arranged their few pieces of furniture, hung their clothes in the press, set out her needlework basket near the window, where the light was best. She was in the final months of her pregnancy now, her body heavy and awkward, her movements slowed by the weight she carried. The child was active, she told Kent, moving constantly within her, as if impatient to enter the world. Kent attended to his business at the Exchange with renewed diligence, conscious that he would soon have another mouth to feed and that his irregular domestic arrangement made his position somewhat precarious. If his employers discovered he was living in sin with his brother's widow, if the scandal became public, he could lose his position. Respectability was currency in the commercial world, and he had spent years building a reputation for steadiness and propriety. In the evenings he would return to Cock Lane, climbing the stairs to their rooms where Fanny waited with supper prepared. They would eat together, speaking of small domestic matters, of preparations for the child's arrival. Kent had arranged for a midwife, a woman recommended by one of Parsons' neighbours who had experience with difficult births. He had purchased fabric for infant clothes, which Fanny was sewing by candlelight when her swollen fingers permitted. They were, in those January evenings, as close to happy as their circumstances allowed. But Fanny had begun to mention strange occurrences in the rooms. She told Kent that she sometimes heard sounds at night when he was away on business, for there were occasions when his work required him to travel to Deptford or Greenwich to inspect cargo or meet with ship's captains. The sounds seemed to come from within the walls, she said, scratching and rustling that could not be explained by the usual nocturnal activities of mice or settling timber. She did not seem frightened by these sounds, merely puzzled. She wondered if perhaps the house had rats. Kent dismissed her concerns. Every old house in London had its share of vermin, its creaking boards and mysterious draughts. He told her to mention it to Parsons, who could set traps if necessary. But privately he worried that her condition was making her nervous, that the physical discomfort of late pregnancy was causing her to imagine disturbances that had no objective existence. One night in late January, when Kent was obliged to travel to Deptford on business, Fanny asked if young Elizabeth Parsons might sleep in the room with her. She did not want to be alone, she explained, and the child would be company. Kent agreed, thinking it a harmless request, and Elizabeth was brought upstairs with her bedding to sleep on a pallet near the fireplace. That was the night the sounds became impossible to ignore. Both Fanny and Elizabeth heard them. Distinct knocking sounds that seemed to come from behind the wainscoting, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to attract attention. Elizabeth was frightened and called for her father, who came upstairs and searched the walls for any sign of rats or loose boards. He found nothing. The knocking continued intermittently through the night, ceasing only near dawn when exhaustion finally allowed the household to sleep. When Kent returned the following evening, Fanny told him what had occurred. She was pale and seemed shaken in a way that her usual calm could not entirely conceal. Elizabeth corroborated the account, describing the knocking in detail, how it had seemed to respond when they spoke to it, how it had grown louder when they tried to ignore it. Kent examined the walls himself, rapping his knuckles against the plaster, listening for any hollow spaces or loose boards. The house was old, he reasoned, and old houses made strange sounds. There would be a rational explanation, but in the nights that followed the sounds continued, and they grew stranger, more complex, more insistent. No longer just scratching or knocking, but patterns of sound that seemed almost like language, like someone tapping out a message in a code no one yet understood. Fanny's time was drawing near. The midwife had examined her and predicted the child would come within the fortnight. Kent began to spend more time at home, unwilling to leave Fanny alone when her labour might begin at any moment. And as he sat in the upstairs rooms on Cock Lane, listening to the sounds that emerged from the walls with increasing frequency, William Kent began to feel the first cold touch of something that might have been fear, or might have been the prescience that some disasters cast before them like shadows. Something was wrong in that house. Something was trying to be heard, and time was running out. Chapter 3. The Midnight Knockings. February came to London with bitter cold and darkness that seemed to press against the windows like something solid. The Thames froze solid enough that boys played on the ice near London Bridge, though the watermen warned against venturing too far from shore where the current still moved beneath its crystalline shell. In the streets, breath hung in clouds, and the poor huddled around braziers, their thin clothes insufficient against the season's cruelty. In the house on Cock Lane, the sounds had become a nightly occurrence. They began always after dark, usually around the hour when the parish church tolled 10 or 11. First would come the scratching, like fingernails drawn slowly across wood. Then the knocking would follow, sharp raps that seemed to travel through the walls, moving from one side of the room to another, as if whatever made them was pacing behind the plaster. Elizabeth Parsons had become the primary witness to these manifestations. After that first night when she had slept in Fanny's room, some unspoken arrangement had developed, whereby the child would spend her nights in the lodger's chambers, sleeping on a pallet near the fireplace. Perhaps Fanny felt safer with the girl's presence. Perhaps Elizabeth's parents saw an opportunity to ingratiate themselves with lodgers who paid their rent promptly. Or perhaps the sounds themselves drew the child there, as if they required a witness of particular innocence to give them substance. The girl would lie rigid on her pallet, her eyes wide in the firelight's glow, listening to the sounds that emerged from the darkness. Sometimes the knocking seemed to come from directly behind her head, so close she could feel vibrations through the wall. Other times it would move to the opposite side of the room, or up near the ceiling, or down near the floorboards, as if whatever made the sounds was not constrained by normal physical limitations. Fanny listened too, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where the child moved restlessly within her. She had stopped dismissing the sounds as rats or settling timbers. They were too deliberate, too responsive to the presence of people in the room. When she spoke aloud, asking if anyone was there, the knocking would intensify. When she prayed, it would cease entirely, only to resume when her prayers ended. This pattern repeated itself night after night, until both woman and child had come to accept that something inexplicable was occurring in those upstairs rooms. Kent remained sceptical. He was a man of commerce, accustomed to dealing in quantities that could be measured and recorded. The supernatural held no place in his understanding of the world. When he was present during the knockings, he would search the room methodically, examining every corner, every piece of furniture, every section of wall where the sounds seemed to originate. He found nothing. No loose boards, no gaps in the plaster, no evidence of rats or birds or any creature that might account for the disturbance. Richard Parsons, drawn upstairs by his daughter's reports, witnessed the phenomena himself on several occasions. He stood in the doorway of the lodger's chamber, his candle held high, while the knocking sounded clearly from the walls around them. He too searched for a natural cause, and found none. The sounds seemed to come from within the structure itself, as if the house had developed a voice and was using it to speak in the only language available to it, the language of percussion, of impact, of something striking against something else in the darkness. Word began to spread beyond the household. Mrs. Parsons mentioned the strange occurrences to her neighbours, and neighbours being what they were in that densely packed quarter of London, the information travelled swiftly up and down Cock Lane and into the surrounding streets. Soon there were curious visitors, women from nearby houses who came ostensibly to call on family, but truly to hear the knockings for themselves. They would sit in the upstairs chamber as evening fell, their hands folded in their laps, their faces tense with anticipation. The sounds did not disappoint them, as if performing for an audience. The knockings would begin shortly after dark, growing louder and more insistent as the night progressed. The visitors would gasp and clutch at one another, their eyes wide in the candlelight. Some prayed aloud, others demanded that the spirit identify itself. A few of the bolder women attempted to communicate with whatever produced the sounds, asking questions and listening for patterns in the knocking that might constitute answers. It was during one of these evening gatherings that someone suggested the sounds might be intelligent, that they might represent an attempt at communication from beyond the natural world. The idea, once spoken, took root with remarkable speed. Ghost stories were common currency in Georgian London. Every parish had its tales of spectral appearances, of phantom coaches and headless horsemen, and ladies in white who walked at midnight. But those were stories told by the fire, entertainment for long winter evenings. This was different. This was happening now, in a house where ordinary people lived, and it was happening with witnesses present who could attest to its reality. Fanny grew weaker as February advanced. The child within her had dropped lower, preparing for birth, and the weight pressed on her bladder and her spine so that she could not sleep comfortably, even when the knocking ceased. The midwife visited regularly, examining her with practised hands, pronouncing that all seemed normal but that the birth would be difficult. First births usually were, particularly for women of slight build. Fanny should rest as much as possible, the midwife advised, and keep her strength for the ordeal ahead. But rest was impossible in that house. The knocking saw to that. It came every night now without fail, sometimes continuing for hours, driving away sleep and filling the darkness with its inexplicable persistence. Fanny would lie in her bed, her hand pressed against her belly, while Elizabeth huddled on her pallet and Kent sat in a chair by the fire, his face grim with worry and frustration. He had begun to suspect that someone was playing an elaborate trick, though he could not imagine who or why. Perhaps one of the neighbours, envious of their rooms or disapproving of their unmarried state. Perhaps even Parsons himself, though to what end Kent could not guess. On the night of February 2nd, the Feast of Candlemas, the knocking was particularly violent. It sounded like blows from a hammer, like someone pounding against the walls with all their strength, and it went on for hours without respite. Fanny wept from exhaustion and fear. Elizabeth covered her ears and prayed in a high, frightened voice. Kent threw open the door to the chamber and shouted into the darkness, demanding that whoever was responsible show themselves. The knocking ceased immediately, as if shocked into silence by his anger. But within minutes it resumed, softer now but more insistent, tap, 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 a rhythm like a heartbeat or like footsteps approaching from a great distance. The midwife came the following morning and found Fanny in a state of near collapse. The constant disturbances had prevented proper rest, and her body was showing the strain. Her face was pale, her hands trembled, and she complained of pains in her back and legs that the midwife recognised as the early stages of labour. The child would come soon, perhaps within days, and Fanny needed to gather her strength for the trial ahead. But that night the knocking returned, and the night after that, and the night after that. It had become as regular as the church bells, as predictable as the dawn. The house on Cock Lane had acquired a reputation that spread beyond the immediate neighbourhood. People began to gather in the street outside, hoping to hear the sounds for themselves. Some claimed they could hear the knocking even from the cobblestones, though whether they truly heard it or only imagined they did, no one could say with certainty. Inside the house, the atmosphere had grown oppressive. The constant attention from neighbours and curious strangers, the nightly ordeal of the knocking, the approach of Fanny's confinement, all of it combined to create a tension that felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened. Mrs. Parsons complained of headaches. Richard Parsons grew short-tempered, snapping at his wife and daughter over trivial matters. Elizabeth stopped eating properly, her small face growing pinched and hollow with exhaustion. And Fanny waited for her time to come, lying in the bed in the upper chamber, while the child moved within her, and the walls around her spoke in their strange percussion language that no one yet understood, but that everyone had begun to fear. Kent tried once more to find a rational explanation. He hired a carpenter to examine the walls, to search for any hollow spaces or loose boards that might amplify normal house sounds into something seemingly supernatural. The carpenter tapped and measured and shook his head, pronouncing the construction solid despite its age. He could find no natural cause for the disturbances. When Kent pressed him, asking if perhaps someone could be hiding in the walls or in the space beneath the floorboards, the carpenter gave him a pitying look. There was no room for a person to hide, he explained. The walls were too thin, the spaces too small. Whatever made the sounds was not human. On February 7th, as a thin snow began to fall over London, Fanny's labour began in earnest. The midwife was summoned, and Elizabeth was sent to sleep in her own bed for the first time in weeks. Kent paced the floor of the chamber below, while above him Fanny laboured through the night, her cries mixing with the sound of the knocking that continued even now, even during this most vulnerable moment. The child was born near dawn, a girl, small but apparently healthy, though she did not cry immediately, and required the midwife's urgent ministrations before her first wail filled the chamber. Fanny was exhausted beyond measure, her body emptied of strength, her face grey in the morning light. The midwife cleaned the infant and placed her in Fanny's arms, but Fanny could barely hold her. Her hand shook, her breathing was shallow, something the midwife realised with growing alarm was wrong. The knocking had stopped when the child was born. For the first time in weeks, the house on Cock Lane was silent. But it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence that comes before something breaks, the held breath before the scream, the pause before disaster makes itself known. Fanny died on February 9th, 2 days after giving birth. She simply grew weaker and weaker despite the midwife's efforts, despite the broths and cordials and desperate prayers. Her body had been pushed too far by the difficult labour, the weeks of sleeplessness, the strain of living with the nightly terror of the knocking. Or perhaps, as some would later whisper, something else had claimed her, something that had been knocking at the walls, trying to get in, and had finally found its way. The infant survived only a few hours longer. Without her mother's milk and too weak to take nourishment from any other source, the tiny girl died in the midwife's arms before noon on the same day. 2 lives extinguished within hours of each other, leaving behind a grief-stricken William Kent and a household that had witnessed more than any of them could fully comprehend. They buried Fanny in the vault of St. John's Clerkenwell 3 days later. The infant was laid in her arms, the 2 coffined together as was customary when mother and child died in childbirth. The service was brief, attended only by Kent and a few neighbours who had known Fanny during her brief residence on Cock Lane. The rector spoke the familiar words about dust and ashes, and the coffin was lowered into the darkness beneath the church floor. That night, for the first time since Fanny's death, the knocking returned to the house on Cock Lane. But now it was different. Now it seemed to carry purpose, intention, even anger. And this time, when Elizabeth Parsons lay rigid in her bed listening to the sounds that emerged from the darkness, she understood that something had changed fundamentally. The knocking was no longer simply noise, it had become a voice, and it had something urgent, something terrible to say. Chapter 4. Fanny's Departure. The death of Frances Lynes was recorded in the parish register of St. John's Clerkenwell on the 10th day of February 1761. The clerk who made the entry, not Richard Parsons, who was too distressed by recent events to attend to his duties, wrote in a careful hand, "Frances Lynes, aged 23 years, died of childbed fever." The cause was common enough that no further explanation seemed necessary. Women died in childbirth with terrible regularity in Georgian London, their bodies failing under the strain of bringing life into the world. The city's graveyards were filled with young mothers whose names were carved beside those of the infants who had killed them. But for those who had known Fanny during her final weeks, her death carried a weight that transcended the merely tragic. They had witnessed her decline through those January nights, when the knocking kept her from sleep. They had seen her grow pale and weak, her strength sapped not just by pregnancy but by something else, something that manifested in sounds no one could explain. When word of her death spread through the neighbourhood, it was accompanied by whispers that perhaps the knocking had not been random disturbance but warning, harbinger, or even cause. William Kent was destroyed by grief. He had lost his brother, then his brother's widow who had become his companion and lover, and finally the child who might have given meaning to their irregular union. Within the space of 18 months, his family, such as it was, had been reduced to nothing. He arranged the burial with mechanical efficiency, paying for the coffin and the rector's fee, and the space in St. John's vault, going through the motions that society demanded, while feeling nothing but a vast emptiness where hope had briefly lived. After the funeral, he could not bear to remain in the rooms on Cock Lane, where Fanny had died. The chambers that had been their home for such a brief time now felt contaminated by loss, every corner holding some memory of her presence. He gathered his belongings, paid Parsons the rent owed, and removed himself to lodgings in Bermondsey, crossed the river where the air smelled of leather from the tanneries and the streets held no associations with his grief. For several weeks the upper rooms on Cock Lane stood empty. Parsons made no effort to let them again. The house had acquired an uncomfortable reputation, and few respectable tenants would want to sleep in chambers where a woman had died in childbed, while mysterious knocking sounded in the walls. Mrs. Parsons cleaned the rooms thoroughly, scrubbing away any trace of Fanny's presence, but the darkness that had settled over the house could not be scrubbed away. It lingered in the corners, pressed against the windows, seemed to move through the rooms like something alive. Elizabeth returned to sleeping in her own small chamber, adjacent to the now empty lodgings. The first night was difficult. She lay rigid beneath her blankets, listening to the silence, half expecting the knocking to resume. But the house remained quiet. Days passed, a week. The knockings did not return, and gradually the household began to relax. Perhaps whatever had caused the disturbances had departed with Fanny's death. Perhaps it had been connected somehow to her presence, to her condition, to some quality she possessed that had attracted or created the phenomenon. With her gone, the house might return to normal. But on the night of February 23rd, exactly 2 weeks after Fanny's burial, Elizabeth woke to the sound of scratching in the wall beside her bed. It began softly, almost tentatively, as if testing whether anyone was listening. The girl lay frozen, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might wake the entire household. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then the knocking began, the same sharp raps that had tormented Fanny during her final weeks, but now they seemed to carry a different quality. Not random disturbance, but purposeful communication, as if whatever produced the sounds had learned language and was trying to speak. Elizabeth called for her father. Richard Parsons came quickly, pulling on his coat as he climbed the stairs, his candle casting wild shadows on the walls. He entered his daughter's room and heard the knocking immediately, distinct raps coming from the wall that separated Elizabeth's chamber from the empty lodgings. He placed his hand against the plaster and felt vibrations beneath his palm, the physical impact of something striking hard against the other side. He opened the door to the lodger's chambers, now dark and unoccupied, and stepped inside. The knocking ceased the moment he entered, as if aware of his presence. He examined the walls by candlelight, searching for any sign of disturbance, any hole or crack that might explain the sounds. He found nothing. The plaster was intact. The wainscoting showed no damage. The room was empty of everything except furniture and shadows. When he returned to Elizabeth's chamber, the knocking resumed immediately. It seemed to follow the child to centre itself wherever she was. Over the following nights, this pattern was confirmed. When Elizabeth was in her room, the sounds were strongest there. When her mother sent her downstairs on errands, the knocking would sometimes follow, manifesting in the floor above her head or in the walls beside the stairs. It was as if the phenomenon had fixed itself upon the girl, had chosen her as its primary witness, or perhaps as its medium. Parsons began to keep careful record of the disturbances. As a parish clerk, he was accustomed to documentation, to the careful preservation of facts. Each night he would note the time the knocking began, how long it continued, what patterns or variations it displayed. He shared these notes with his neighbours, and word spread quickly through Clerkenwell that the haunting on Cock Lane had resumed with new intensity. It was Mary Fraser, a neighbour who had known Fanny slightly, who first articulated what many were beginning to suspect. She came to call on Mrs. Parsons one afternoon in early March, and after the usual pleasantries she spoke her mind. The knocking, she suggested, might be the spirit of poor Frances Lynes. The young woman had died so suddenly, so tragically, leaving behind unfinished business. Perhaps she was trying to communicate from beyond the grave. Perhaps she had something important to tell them. The idea spread through the neighbourhood like fire through dry timber. A ghost. Not merely mysterious sounds, but the actual spirit of a dead woman trying to make herself heard. The suggestion transformed the phenomenon from mere curiosity into something far more significant. Death had always been close in Georgian London. It lurked in every fever, every childbirth, every journey through streets where horses might bolt or buildings might collapse. But the boundary between the living and the dead was understood to be absolute. If that boundary could be crossed, if the dead could return to speak to the living, then everything humanity believed about death and judgment and the soul's final disposition was called into question. People began to visit the house on Cock Lane in increasing numbers. They came in the evenings, asking permission to sit with Elizabeth during the knocking, hoping to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Parsons, perhaps sensing an opportunity, began to admit visitors. His home became a kind of exhibition space, with neighbours and strangers crowding into Elizabeth's small chamber as darkness fell, waiting with breathless anticipation for the sounds to begin. The knocking seemed to respond to this attention. It grew louder, more dramatic, more regular in its manifestations. It no longer simply knocked, but seemed to answer questions, with one rap for yes and two raps for no. This discovery, that the sounds could be used for communication, transformed the gatherings on Cock Lane from passive observation into active interrogation. Visitors began asking questions of the supposed spirit, and the spirit, through its pattern of raps, appeared to answer. Was it the ghost of Frances Lynes? One rap. Yes. Had she died naturally? Two raps. No. Was she trying to tell them something important? One rap. Yes. The questions grew more specific, more urgent. Had she been murdered? One rap. Yes. Did she know who killed her? One rap. Yes. Would she name the murderer? One rap. Yes. And then came the question that would transform a ghost story into a scandal that would consume Georgian London. Was William Kent responsible for her death? One rap, clear and unmistakable. Yes. The accusation once made could not be unmade. It spread through Clerkenwell and beyond, carried by the visitors who had witnessed the spirit's testimony, embellished with each retelling, until all of London seemed to know that the ghost of Frances Lynes had returned from the grave to accuse her lover of murder. That he had poisoned her, the spirit claimed through its knocking. That he had given her arsenic in the days before her labour began, enough to weaken her so that childbirth would finish what the poison had started. That he had done this to claim her inheritance, or to free himself from their irregular union, or simply because he was cruel. William Kent, living quietly in his Bermondsey lodgings, trying to rebuild his life from the ruins of his grief, knew nothing of these accusations until a friend brought him word. At first he could not believe what he was hearing, a ghost, accusations of murder communicated through knocking. It seemed like madness, like something from a penny dreadful rather than reality. But his friend assured him the story was spreading rapidly, that Kent's name was being spoken in connection with the most serious crime imaginable, and that he must act quickly to defend his reputation. Kent returned to Clerkenwell, determined to confront Richard Parsons and put an end to this grotesque performance. He arrived at the house on Cock Lane on a cold March evening and demanded entry. Parsons, perhaps fearing a violent confrontation, initially refused. But Kent stood in the street outside shouting his innocence to the curious crowd that had gathered, and eventually Parsons relented. The two men faced each other in the narrow passage of the house, their voices rising in argument. Kent accused Parsons of orchestrating an elaborate fraud, perhaps as revenge for some perceived slight or simply to profit from the attention the haunting had brought. Parsons insisted he was as mystified as anyone by the phenomena, that he had no control over the knocking, that the spirit manifested of its own will. Their argument attracted the attention of the entire household and several neighbours, and soon the narrow street outside was filled with people drawn by the commotion. Kent demanded to witness the knocking himself to ask his own questions of the supposed spirit. Parsons agreed, and that evening Kent sat in Elizabeth's chamber while the girl lay in her bed, and the knocking began. It was as described, clear, distinct raps that seemed to come from the walls and that appeared to respond to questions. Kent spoke directly to whatever produced the sounds, asking if it was truly Fanny's spirit. One rap. Yes. He asked if he had harmed her. One rap. Yes. He asked how he could have poisoned her when he had been away on business during her final days and when she had been attended by a midwife who would have noticed any signs of poisoning. The knocking offered no response to this more complex question, but began again after a moment, insistent and accusatory. Kent left Cock Lane that night more troubled than when he had arrived. He had witnessed the knocking himself, had felt the strange power of those mysterious sounds manifesting in darkness. He could not explain them, but he knew with absolute certainty that he had not harmed Fanny, that he had loved her and mourned her, and would have protected her with his life if such protection had been possible. If this was truly her spirit speaking from beyond death, then it was lying, and if it was not her spirit but a fraud perpetrated by the Parsons family, then it was a fraud so skillfully executed that Kent could detect no evidence of trickery. He consulted a lawyer who advised him that accusations delivered by a ghost would carry no weight in any court of law. But the lawyer also warned that Kent's reputation was in grave danger, that the court of public opinion had different standards of evidence, and that thousands of Londoners were already convinced of his guilt based solely on the testimony of mysterious knockings in a haunted house. The ghost of Cock Lane had ceased to be merely a curiosity. It had become an accuser, a witness, a voice crying out from beyond the grave demanding justice for a murder that may or may not have occurred. And Georgian London, equally fascinated by the supernatural and by scandal, could speak of nothing else. Chapter 5. The Ghost Takes Form. March brought warmer air to London, but no warmth came to the house on Cock Lane. The dwelling had become a site of pilgrimage for those who believed in the spirit's testimony, and a fascination for those who merely sought entertainment in the spectacle of the supernatural made manifest. Every evening as darkness fell, crowds gathered to her in the narrow street outside, pressing close to the house, straining to hear any sound that might confirm the rumours spreading through the city. Richard Parsons had ceased to control the situation, if indeed he ever had controlled it. What had begun as a private family disturbance had grown into something far larger than any single household could contain. The knocking now occurred with such regularity and intensity that it seemed less a haunting than a performance, as if the spirit, or whatever produced the sounds, had learned to play to an audience and derived some satisfaction from the attention it received. Elizabeth remained at the centre of the phenomenon. The child had grown pale and thin from the constant disruption of her sleep, and the unrelenting attention focused upon her. She no longer attended to her usual household duties, but spent her days in a state of nervous exhaustion, dreading the approach of evening when she would be required once more to lie in her bed while strangers crowded into her chamber to witness the manifestations that occurred around her. The methodology of communication had grown more sophisticated, where once the spirit had answered only simple yes or no questions with one rap or two, it now employed more complex systems. Someone had suggested using the alphabet, having the spirit knock when the correct letter was spoken, and through this laborious process entire sentences could be spelled out. The process took hours, but those who gathered in the chamber seemed willing to devote whatever time was necessary to hear what the dead might say to the living. Through these painstaking sessions, the spirit elaborated upon its accusations against William Kent. It claimed that he had obtained arsenic from an apothecary near the Royal Exchange, that he had mixed it with Fanny's food during the days before her labour began, that he had done so deliberately and with full knowledge that the poison combined with the strain of childbirth would kill her. The spirit provided details that seemed impossibly specific, the name of the apothecary, the date of the purchase, even the amount paid for the poison. Those who believed in the haunting seized upon these details as proof of its authenticity. How could Richard Parsons or his daughter know such information unless it came from Fanny herself, speaking from beyond death? How could they invent such elaborate particulars about events they had not witnessed and places they had never visited? The specificity of the accusation seemed to argue for their truth, but there were skeptics even in those early days of the hauntings' fame. Some who attended the sessions in Elizabeth's chamber noticed inconsistencies in the spirit's testimony. The details, while specific, could not always be verified. The apothecary named by the spirit denied any memory of selling arsenic to William Kent. The dates given for various events did not align with documented facts about Kent's whereabouts. When confronted with these contradictions, the spirit would grow confused or angry, the knocking becoming violent and irregular, as if whatever intelligence directed it was frustrated by challenges to its narrative. The Reverend Stephen Aldrich of St John's, Clerkenwell, became involved in March, drawn by concern for his parishioners and by the theological implications of a spirit manifesting so publicly. He had buried Fanny Lynes in his churchyard, had spoken the prayers over her coffin, and had recorded her death in his register. If her spirit had truly returned to accuse a living man of murder, then the church had an obligation to investigate. Aldrich attended several of the evening sessions on Cock Lane, sitting quietly in the corner of Elizabeth's chamber while the knocking occurred and questions were posed to the spirit. He was a man of education and piety, trained at Cambridge, versed in scripture and in the writings of the church fathers on matters of spirits and demons. He listened carefully, observed closely, and grew increasingly troubled by what he witnessed. After several nights of observation, Aldrich requested a private audience with Richard Parsons. The two men sat in Parsons' small parlour, away from the crowds and the performance of the haunting, and spoke plainly. Aldrich expressed his doubts about the phenomenon's supernatural origin. He had seen nothing that could not potentially be explained by human agency, by trick or by fraud. The child Elizabeth could be moving in her bed in ways that created sounds. Someone could be hidden in the walls or in adjacent rooms, producing the knocking through mechanical means. The entire affair might be an elaborate deception designed to harm William Kent's reputation or simply to profit from public curiosity. Parsons protested his innocence. He had not created the haunting, he insisted. He was as mystified as anyone by the sounds that plagued his household. If anything, the disturbances had harmed his family. His daughter was ill from lack of sleep. His wife was distraught. His home had been invaded by strangers, and his own reputation was now questionable. Why would he perpetrate such a fraud when it brought him nothing but trouble? Aldrich had no answer to this, but his suspicions remained. He suggested that the sessions be conducted under more controlled conditions, with observers stationed in adjacent rooms and in the street outside, with Elizabeth examined before and after the manifestations to ensure she carried no device that might produce the sounds. Parsons agreed to these measures, perhaps hoping they would vindicate him, perhaps believing he had no choice given the rector's authority in the parish. The controlled observations were conducted over several nights in late March. Men of standing, merchants, lawyers, even a physician from Bart's Hospital stationed themselves throughout the house and in the street outside. Elizabeth was examined by a midwife before being put to bed to ensure she concealed nothing on her person or in her bedclothes. The chamber was searched thoroughly for any hidden apparatus. Every precaution that reasonable men could devise was implemented. And still the knocking came. It sounded as clearly as ever, loud enough to be heard throughout the house and even by those standing in the street below. The observers in adjacent rooms detected no movement, no human agency that might explain the sounds. The knocking seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the house, and no amount of scrutiny could reveal its source. This apparent confirmation of the haunting's authenticity drove public interest to new heights. If men of education and standing could witness the phenomenon and find no evidence of fraud, then surely the spirit was genuine. The story reached beyond Clerkenwell, beyond the immediate neighbourhoods of North London, and spread throughout the metropolis. Coffee houses buzzed with debate about the ghost. Newspapers carried accounts of the haunting, some credulous and others sceptical, but all acknowledging that something extraordinary was occurring on Cock Lane. The spirit's testimony became more elaborate with each session. It claimed that Kent had plotted Fanny's death for months, that he had never truly loved her, but had seen her only as a means to obtain her inheritance. It described conversations between Kent and Fanny that no one else could have heard, providing intimate details of their private life together. Some of these details were accurate enough that Kent himself, when informed of them, could not deny their truth. But he maintained that such knowledge proved nothing except that someone had been spying on them, listening at doors, perhaps bribing servants to reveal private matters. Kent engaged a lawyer named James Frances to defend his reputation and to investigate the haunting with the aim of exposing it as fraud. Frances was a practical man, sceptical of supernatural claims, and he approached the case as he would any legal matter, by gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and searching for inconsistencies in the opposing narrative. His investigation revealed several troubling facts. Richard Parsons, it emerged, had quarrelled with William Kent over money. Kent had lent Parsons a small sum, 12 shillings, which Parsons had failed to repay despite repeated requests. The debt was trivial, but it established a motive for Parsons to wish Kent harm. Frances also discovered that Parsons had been in financial difficulty for some time, that his position as parish clerk barely provided sufficient income for his family's needs, and that the attention focused on his house had brought him a certain prominence and even small sums from visitors who paid to witness the haunting. These findings suggested a possible motive for fraud, but they did not explain how the fraud was being accomplished. Franzen attended several sessions himself, watching Elizabeth carefully, observing the room and the observers, and listening to the knocking that sounded so clearly in the darkness. He could detect no trickery. If this was fraud, it was being executed with extraordinary skill. The ghost's advocates grew bolder in their claims. Some suggested that the spirit should be allowed to testify in court, that its accusations should be investigated by magistrates, that William Kent should be formally charged with murder based on the evidence provided by supernatural testimony. Others argued that the church should conduct an exorcism, that the spirit's presence in the mortal world was contrary to divine law, that it should be commanded to return to whatever realm it had come from and leave the living in peace. Neither course was pursued. The law had no mechanism for accepting testimony from spirits, and the church was reluctant to validate the haunting through formal exorcism. But the debate itself revealed how profoundly the Cock Lane ghost had disrupted the settled certainties of Georgian society. If the dead could return to accuse the living, what other boundaries might prove permeable? What other rules might be subject to revision? Through all of this, Elizabeth Parsons lay night after night in her bed, while the knocking sounded around her, and strangers asked their questions, and the spirit spelled out its accusations letter by letter. The child had become a medium, a vessel through which the supernatural apparently manifested itself. Whether she was willing participant, innocent victim, or something more complex, no one could say with certainty. She spoke little during the sessions, answering questions put to her in a soft voice, confirming that she heard the sounds, that she felt sometimes as if something touched her in the darkness, that she was frightened, but also strangely compelled to continue. Her father watched over these sessions with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The attention brought to his household elevated his standing in the parish, gave him an importance he had never possessed as a mere clerk scratching figures in ledgers. But it also exposed him to scrutiny and suspicion, made him the subject of gossip and speculation, threatened to destroy the modest respectability he'd spent years building. Mrs. Parsons remained largely silent throughout the affair. She tended to her household duties, prepared meals, cleaned the chambers, and endured the invasion of privacy that came with having strangers constantly present in her home. What she thought about the haunting, whether she believed in its supernatural origin or suspected some other explanation, she kept to herself. As March gave way to April, the knocking showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, it grew more powerful, more insistent, as if whatever force drove it was gathering strength, rather than dissipating. The crowds outside the house grew larger. The sessions inside grew longer and more dramatic, and the accusations against William Kent grew more detailed and more damning with each passing night. London had witnessed many wonders and many scandals in its long history, but nothing quite like this. A ghost that spoke through knocking, a murdered woman accusing her lover from beyond the grave, a child lying pale and exhausted in her bed, while the supernatural manifested itself around her, and the whole city watched and wondered and argued about what it meant. The Cock Lane ghost had ceased to be a private matter or even a neighbourhood curiosity. It had become a phenomenon that spoke to fundamental questions about death and justice and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds, and it was far from finished telling its story. Chapter 6. The City Comes to Listen. By the middle of April, the house on Cock Lane had become one of the most famous addresses in London. Thousands knew its location. Hundreds had visited it personally. Dozens claimed to have witnessed the supernatural manifestations that occurred there nightly. The narrow street that had once carried only local traffic now saw carriages from fashionable neighbourhoods depositing curious visitors at Parsons' door. Ladies and gentlemen of quality stepping carefully over the kennels that ran with filth, holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses, as they entered the cramped dwelling where a ghost supposedly held court. The composition of the crowds had changed. What had begun with neighbours and local tradespeople had expanded to include members of parliament, wealthy merchants, army officers, even nobility who came incognito to witness the phenomenon without attracting attention to their presence. The haunting had transcended class boundaries. Rich and poor alike wanted to hear the dead woman speak, wanted to judge for themselves whether her accusations carried the weight of supernatural truth or merely human deception. Richard Parsons had been forced to implement some system for managing the visitors. His small house could not accommodate everyone who wished to attend the evening sessions, and the crush of bodies created both discomfort and danger. He began to limit admittance, allowing only a certain number of observers into Elizabeth's chamber at any given time, with others waiting their turn in the parlour below or in the street outside. Some visitors offered money for the privilege of witnessing the manifestations, and Parsons, whether from financial need or simple pragmatism, accepted these offerings. The haunting, whatever its origin, had become an enterprise. The newspapers had discovered the story. The Public Ledger, the London Chronicle, the Gentleman's Magazine, all carried accounts of the Cock Lane ghost, some credulous and others sceptical, but all acknowledging that the phenomenon had captured public imagination in a manner unprecedented in recent memory. The articles varied in their details, embellished or restrained according to each publication's character, but they agreed on certain facts: that a child named Elizabeth Parsons was at the centre of mysterious manifestations, that these manifestations supposedly represented the spirit of Frances Lynes, and that the spirit accused William Kent of murder. The publicity brought new categories of visitors to Cock Lane. Men of science began to appear, natural philosophers who approached the haunting as they might approach any phenomenon requiring investigation and explanation. They brought with them the tools of empirical inquiry, notebooks for recording observations, instruments for measuring vibrations, skeptical minds trained to seek natural causes before admitting supernatural ones. To Samuel Johnson, the celebrated author and moralist, came to Cock Lane in late April. He arrived after dark accompanied by several friends, and requested permission to observe the manifestations. Parsons, perhaps intimidated by Johnson's reputation, granted immediate admittance. The great man settled his bulk into a chair in Elizabeth's chamber, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the room, his mind already engaged in the problem of determining truth from fabrication. The knocking began as it always did, shortly after the candles were dimmed. Johnson listened intently, his head cocked to one side, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When the spirit began responding to questions, Johnson posed several of his own, phrased with the precision of a man accustomed to examining arguments for logical flaws. He asked the spirit to knock in specific patterns, to demonstrate that it understood complex instructions. He asked it to provide information that could be verified independently, that would prove its knowledge extended beyond what any living person present might know. The spirit's responses were inconsistent. Sometimes it complied with Johnson's requests, producing knocking patterns that seemed to demonstrate intelligence and understanding. Other times it fell silent or produced only confused and irregular sounds, as if offended by the nature of the inquiry. Johnson noted all of this carefully, his face betraying neither belief nor disbelief. After several hours of observation, Johnson departed without making any public statement about what he had witnessed, but he returned the following night, and the night after that, bringing different companions each time, subjecting the phenomenon to repeated scrutiny. He requested that Elizabeth be examined before each session, that the room be searched, that observers be stationed where they might detect any trickery. All of these precautions were implemented, and still the knocking occurred. Still the spirit seemed to manifest itself in ways that defied simple explanation. The Reverend John Moore, rector of St. Bartholomew the Great, also took interest in the case. Moore was a man of both faith and learning, educated at Oxford, author of several theological works, and possessed of a mind that sought to reconcile religious belief with rational inquiry. He saw in the Cock Lane ghost an opportunity to examine a question that had occupied theologians for centuries. Could the dead truly return to communicate with the living? And if so, what did such communication reveal about the nature of the afterlife? Moore attended multiple sessions on Cock Lane, approaching the phenomenon with neither immediate belief nor automatic skepticism. He observed carefully. He questioned the spirit on matters of theology, asking it to describe the realm from which it claimed to speak, to explain why it had been permitted to return to the mortal world. The spirit's responses were vague and sometimes contradictory, offering no clear picture of the afterlife and no compelling theological insight. This troubled Moore, for he reasoned that if the spirit were truly that of a Christian woman returned from judgment, it should possess knowledge of spiritual matters beyond anything available to the living. Other clergymen came as well, from various parishes and denominations, each bringing their own theological framework to the investigation. Some saw in the haunting evidence of God's justice proof that Buddha could not remain hidden even beyond death. Others detected the work of demons, evil spirits masquerading as a human soul to sow confusion and lead the faithful astray. A few maintained rigid skepticism, insisting that no genuine supernatural phenomenon could occur, that all such manifestations must necessarily be fraud or delusion regardless of how convincing they might appear. The physicians who visited Cock Lane approached the case from yet another angle. They examined Elizabeth Parsons with clinical thoroughness, searching for any physical condition that might explain her connection to the manifestations. They checked her for signs of epilepsy or hysteria, conditions believed to make certain individuals susceptible to supernatural influence. They questioned her about her health, her diet, her monthly courses. They observed her movements during the sessions, looking for any subtle actions that might produce sounds mistaken for spirit manifestations. Dr. Thomas Addington, physician to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, examined Elizabeth on several occasions. He found her to be a normal child in most respects, though clearly exhausted and distressed by the constant attention and disruption of her routine. He detected no physical abnormality that might explain the phenomenon, but he noted that Elizabeth seemed to enter a peculiar state during the sessions, her body becoming rigid, her breathing shallow, her awareness of her surroundings diminished. Whether this state represented some form of trance or merely the child's response to stress and fear, Addington could not determine with certainty. The legal community also took interest in the Cock Lane ghost. The question of whether testimony from spirits could be admitted in criminal proceedings had no precedent in English law. Could William Kent be charged with murder based solely on accusations delivered through knocking? Could a jury be asked to render a verdict on such evidence? The questions were fascinating to legal scholars, touching as they did on fundamental issues of evidence and testimony. Several magistrates visited Cock Lane to assess the situation. They came in their official capacity, representing the interests of justice and public order. They listened to the spirit's accusations against Kent. They questioned Richard Parsons about the manifestations and about his relationship with the accused. They examined the child Elizabeth to ensure she was not being coerced or mistreated. But they brought no formal charges. The evidence, however compelling it might seem to believers, was too strange, too unprecedented to form the basis of a criminal prosecution. William Kent himself became a regular presence in the vicinity of Cock Lane, though he never again entered Parsons' house after his confrontational visit in March. He would stand in the street outside, sometimes shouting his innocence to the crowds, sometimes merely watching in grim silence as visitors came and went. His appearance had deteriorated. He had grown thin and haggard, his clothes less carefully maintained, his bearing that of a man crushed by circumstances beyond his control. The accusations had cost him his position at the exchange. His employer, unwilling to be associated with scandal, had dismissed him. His friends had largely abandoned him. His reputation, once solid and respectable, had been destroyed by a ghost. He engaged in public exchanges with some of the visitors to Cock Lane, arguing his case to anyone who would listen. He produced documents showing his whereabouts on the days the spirit claimed he had purchased poison. He brought witnesses who testified to his good character and his evident grief at Fanny's death. He offered to submit to any test, any examination, any investigation that might prove his innocence. But the ghost's advocates dismissed his evidence as the desperate fabrications of a guilty man, and the crowds who gathered each evening seemed more in the spectacle of the haunting than in the question of Kent's actual guilt or innocence. The phenomenon had become entertainment, a diversion from the ordinary difficulties of life in Georgian London. People came to Cock Lane not necessarily because they believed in the ghost or cared about justice for Frances Lynes, but because the haunting offered something extraordinary in a world that was often merely hard and dull. They wanted to believe that death was not final, that the boundary between this world and the next was permeable, that there were forces and mysteries beyond the reach of reason and science. Some visitors claimed to experience supernatural effects themselves while in the house. They reported feelings of cold despite the warmth of so many bodies pressed together in small rooms. They described sensations of being touched by unseen hands. They spoke of seeing shadows move in ways that could not be explained by candlelight. Whether these experiences were genuine or merely the product of expectation and atmosphere, they added to the house's reputation and to the conviction among believers that something truly supernatural was occurring there. The sessions grew longer and more elaborate. Multiple questions would be posed to the spirit, spelling out entire narratives through the laborious process of knocking at each letter. The spirit described Fanny's life before coming to London, her marriage to John Kent, her courtship by William. It provided details about the house in Lynham, about the public house Fanny had managed, about conversations and events that supposedly occurred years earlier. Some of these details could be verified, which strengthened belief among some observers. Others could not be checked, which allowed skeptics to dismiss them as fabrication. Through all of this, Elizabeth Parsons remained the still centre of the whirlwind. Night after night she lay in her bed while strangers crowded around her, while the knocking sounded from the walls, while her father answered questions and managed the crowds and collected the small payments that kept his household afloat. The child had become a commodity, an attraction, the essential element without which the haunting could not occur. What she thought about this role, whether she understood fully what was happening around her, remained unclear. She spoke little, she answered questions when asked, and she endured. London had seen many sensations and scandals, but nothing quite like the Cock Lane ghost. The haunting combined elements of murder mystery, supernatural thriller, and public spectacle in ways that crossed every boundary of class and education. Rich and poor, learned and ignorant, believer and skeptic, all came to Cock Lane to judge for themselves whether a dead woman could truly speak through knocking, whether justice could be delivered from beyond the grave, whether the age of miracles and wonders had not ended after all, but merely awaited the right circumstances to manifest itself once more. And the knocking continued, night after night, loud and insistent, as if whatever produced those sounds was determined to be heard regardless of who listened or who believed. Chapter 7. The Questions and the Answers. The methodology of communicating with the spirit had evolved into a sophisticated system by early May. The simple pattern of one knock for yes and two for no had proven insufficient for the complex testimony the ghost apparently wished to deliver. Through trial and error, a more elaborate code had emerged. Questions would be posed and someone, usually Richard Parsons or one of the regular witnesses, would recite the alphabet slowly. When the correct letter was reached, the knocking would sound. Letter by letter, word by word, entire sentences could be constructed through this painstaking process. The sessions might last 4 or 5 hours, with observers growing cramped and weary in the close quarters of Elizabeth's chamber while the alphabet was recited dozens of times, the knocking indicating each letter, the accumulated words written down by scribes who attended for that purpose. What emerged from these marathon sessions was a detailed narrative of Frances Lynes' final months, her relationship with William Kent, and the circumstances that supposedly led to her murder. According to the spirit's testimony, William Kent had grown tired of Fanny shortly after they came to London. The initial passion of their union had faded, replaced by irritation at the constraints their irregular situation imposed. He could not marry her legally. He could not present her in respectable society as his wife. Their relationship, which had seemed romantic and exciting in the first flush of love, had become a burden that limited his prospects and damaged his reputation. The inheritance Fanny had received from John Kent became, in the spirit's account, the primary motive for murder. William Kent was entitled to that inheritance only if Fanny died without children and without remarrying. If she lived and eventually married another man, the money would pass with her to her new husband. If she had a child, the inheritance would be held in trust for that child. Only her death while still connected to William would ensure the money came to him. When Fanny became pregnant, the spirit claimed, William realized that the child would complicate his claim to her inheritance. He determined therefore that both mother and child must die, and that their deaths must appear natural. He obtained arsenic from an apothecary. The spirit provided a name, though the apothecary in question denied any memory of the transaction, and began administering small doses to Fanny in her food. The poison, according to this narrative, weakened Fanny gradually over the final weeks of her pregnancy. It did not kill her outright, which might have aroused suspicion, but it sapped her strength, compromised her health, and ensured that when labour began she would lack the constitution to survive it. The spirit described experiencing strange symptoms during those final weeks, dizziness, nausea, beyond what pregnancy normally caused, a metallic taste in her mouth, pains in her stomach that came and went without pattern. William Kent, when informed of these specific accusations, responded with detailed refutation. He produced records showing he had been away on business during several of the days when the spirit claimed he had been poisoning Fanny's food. He brought forward the midwife who had attended Fanny during her final days, and she testified that she had observed no symptoms consistent with poisoning, that Fanny's death had appeared to result from natural causes related to a difficult childbirth. He noted that no autopsy had been performed, no examination of Fanny's body that might have revealed evidence of poison, and that the spirit's accusations therefore could not be verified or disproven by physical evidence. But the spirit's advocates argued that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. Arsenic poisoning, they pointed out, could be difficult to detect, particularly if administered in small doses over time. The symptoms the spirit described, the weakness, the nausea, the stomach pains, could easily have been attributed to pregnancy and dismissed by the midwife as normal complaints. And William Kent's documented absences on certain days did not prove he had not poisoned Fanny on other days when his presence was confirmed. The question of how the spirit possessed such detailed knowledge became central to debates about the haunting's authenticity. If Richard Parsons or his daughter were fabricating the ghost's testimony, how could they know intimate details about Kent and Fanny's relationship? How could they describe conversations that had occurred in private between the couple? How could they provide specific information about dates and places and events that they could not have witnessed themselves? The spirit supporters argued that only supernatural knowledge could explain the specificity of the accusations. The ghost was providing information that no living person except William Kent could possess, which proved that the source of the testimony was indeed Frances Lynes speaking from beyond death. The precision of details, rather than undermining the ghost's credibility, actually confirmed it. Skeptics offered alternative explanations. Perhaps Fanny had confided in neighbours or friends during her life on Cock Lane, sharing details about her relationship with Kent that had then been passed to the Parsons family. Perhaps someone had been spying on Kent and Fanny, listening at doors and windows, gathering information that was now being deployed to construct a plausible but false narrative. Perhaps Kent himself had enemies who were feeding information to Parsons, using the ghost as a weapon to destroy a man they wished to harm for reasons having nothing to do with Fanny's death. The spirit seemed to anticipate these objections. Through its knocking, it provided information that supposedly could not have been obtained through ordinary means. It described a birthmark on Fanny's body that only an intimate partner would have seen. It revealed the contents of letters Fanny had written but never sent, letters that supposedly remained hidden in Kent's possession. It named people Fanny had known in Lynham, relationships from her life before London that the Parsons family could not reasonably have discovered. Kent denied some of these claims and could not address others without revealing details of his private life that he wished to keep hidden. The birthmark existed, he admitted, though he insisted that Fanny might have mentioned it to neighbours during conversation about bathing or dressing. The letters existed as well, though he claimed they contained nothing incriminating, merely the ordinary correspondence between two people living as husband and wife. As for the names from Fanny's past, some were accurate and others were not, suggesting to Kent that the spirit was mixing truth with fabrication to create an appearance of supernatural knowledge. The questioning of the spirit became increasingly confrontational. Those who believed in the haunting demanded that the ghost provide proof that would convince even the most hardened skeptic. Those who suspected fraud challenged the spirit to demonstrate knowledge or abilities that could not be explained by human agency. The atmosphere in Elizabeth's chamber during these sessions grew tense, almost hostile, as if the observers were conducting a trial with the ghost as defendant and its credibility as the verdict to be rendered. The spirit responded to this pressure with its own displays of anger or distress. The knocking would sometimes become violent during these challenging sessions, thunderous blows against the walls that seemed to shake the entire house. At other times, the spirit would fall silent entirely, refusing to answer questions, as if offended by the skepticism of those present. These variations in behaviour were interpreted differently by believers and doubters. To believers, the spirit's emotional responses proved its humanity, demonstrated that it retained feelings and personality beyond death. To doubters, the theatricality suggested conscious performance, a human intelligence behind the manifestation adjusting its behaviour to manipulate the audience. John Moore, the rector who had taken such interest in the case, proposed a test that he believed would definitively establish the truth. He suggested that the spirit be asked to provide information about the afterlife, about the nature of heaven or hell or judgment, knowledge that should be accessible to any soul that had passed beyond death. If the ghost was truly Frances Lynes returned from the realm of the dead, it should be able to describe that realm with authority that no living person could counterfeit. The test was conducted on a May evening with more than 30 witnesses present, including several clergymen and men of science. Moore himself posed the questions, asking the spirit to describe what it had seen after death, what judgment it had faced, what the landscape of the afterlife resembled. The spirit's responses, spelled out laboriously through the alphabet, were vague and unsatisfying. It spoke of darkness and cold, of being lost between worlds, of being unable to find peace until justice was achieved. But it provided no specific theological detail, no description of heaven's architecture or hell's torments, nothing that might serve as evidence of actual experience beyond death. Moore emerged from this session deeply troubled. The spirit's failure to provide convincing testimony about the afterlife suggested to him that it was either not a genuine ghost or that it was a demonic entity masquerading as Frances Lynes. Either conclusion had disturbing implications. If not genuine, then the entire phenomenon was fraud. If demonic, then those who attended the sessions were potentially placing themselves in spiritual danger by communicating with evil forces. Yet the knocking continued unabated, and the crowds continued to come. The question of the ghost authenticity had become less important to many observers than the entertainment value of the spectacle itself. People came to Cock Lane not necessarily to solve a mystery, but to participate in an event, to be part of something extraordinary that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. William Kent, watching from the street outside, understood that he was losing the battle for public opinion regardless of the truth. The ghost had become a story that London wanted to believe, a narrative of murder and supernatural justice that satisfied some deep hunger in the collective imagination. Whether he had actually killed Fanny mattered less than the fact that the ghost accusation made for compelling drama. He continued to protest his innocence, continued to present evidence of his whereabouts and his grief and his inability to have committed the crime of which he stood accused. but his voice was drowned out by the knocking that sounded night after night from the walls of the house on Cock Lane, by the spirit that spoke with such apparent certainty about his guilt, by the thousands who had convinced themselves they were witnessing justice delivered from beyond the grave. And Elizabeth Parsons lay in her bed at the centre of it all, her face pale in the candlelight, her small body rigid with tension, while the questions were asked and the alphabet was recited and the knocking spelled out its accusations letter by letter, word by word, building a case against a living man with testimony from the dead. Chapter 8. The Investigation. The month of May brought with it a shift in the character of public attention focused upon Cock Lane. What had been primarily spectacle and entertainment began to transform into something more serious. A formal investigation that would attempt to determine, once and for all, whether the manifestations were genuine supernatural phenomena or elaborate human fraud. The transformation came not from any single decision, but from the accumulated pressure of skeptics who insisted that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that evidence must be gathered through rigorous examination rather than passive observation. The impetus for formal investigation came from multiple quarters. Samuel Johnson, who had attended several sessions and remained publicly uncommitted regarding his conclusions, began organising a committee of inquiry. He gathered men of standing and education, physicians, clergymen, lawyers, and natural philosophers, who would approach the haunting with systematic rigour. Their aim was not to debunk or validate, but to examine, to apply the methods of rational inquiry to a phenomenon that seemed to defy rationality. William Kent, desperate to clear his name, petitioned the Lord Mayor of London to intervene. He argued that his reputation and livelihood had been destroyed by accusations that had no foundation in law or evidence, that he was being convicted in the court of public opinion without any opportunity to defend himself properly, and that the civil authorities had an obligation to determine whether the ghost was genuine or whether he was the victim of a malicious conspiracy. The Lord Mayor, Sir Samuel Fludyer, agreed to examine the matter, though he approached it with evident reluctance. The case was unprecedented. No established procedure existed for investigating claims of supernatural manifestation. The Church of England also moved toward formal involvement. The Bishop of London, though initially hesitant to engage with what might prove to be either fraud or demonic activity, recognised that the phenomenon was creating theological confusion among the faithful. If the Cock Lane ghost was genuine, it had profound implications for Christian understanding of death and resurrection. If fraudulent, it represented a serious challenge to religious authority, for thousands had been led to believe in supernatural events that might have no supernatural origin. The bishop appointed a commission of senior clergy to investigate and report their findings. These various investigations proceeded simultaneously through late May and early June, each with its own methodology and priorities. The result was a convergence of scrutiny upon the house on Cock Lane and upon the Parsons family that far exceeded anything they had experienced during the months when visitors came merely to witness and wonder. Samuel Johnson's committee conducted its examination with methodical thoroughness. They began by interviewing everyone connected with the case: Richard Parsons and his wife and daughter, the neighbours who had first witnessed the knockings, the midwife who had attended Fanny during her final days, even the rector who had buried her. Each witness was questioned separately and in detail, their statements recorded and compared for consistency. Johnson himself took extensive notes, his sharp mind detecting contradictions and implausibilities in various accounts. The committee then turned to physical examination of the house itself. They measured the walls to determine their thickness and construction. They searched for hidden passages or concealed spaces where a person might hide to produce knocking sounds. They examined the floors above and below Elizabeth's chamber, looking for any mechanism by which sounds might be transmitted or amplified. They brought instruments to measure vibrations, determining whether the knocking resulted from actual impacts against the walls or from some other source. This examination revealed no obvious means of fraud. The walls were solid lath and plaster construction, too thin to conceal a person, but showing no signs of modification or hidden apparatus. The floors and ceilings appeared undisturbed. No mechanical device could be detected that might produce the sounds. If this was trickery, it was being accomplished through means that left no physical trace. The committee then observed multiple sessions during which the knocking occurred. They stationed members in every adjacent room and in the street outside, each observer recording precisely what they heard and when. They noted that the sounds did indeed seem to emanate from the walls of Elizabeth's chamber, that they were clearly audible throughout the house, and that they occurred in patterns consistent with intelligent communication rather than random disturbance. But Johnson's keen observation detected something that others had missed or dismissed. The knocking, he noted, occurred only when Elizabeth was in her bed and only when she was beneath her blankets. When the child sat up or stood, the sounds ceased. When she lay down again and pulled the covers over herself, they resumed. This pattern suggested that the child's position and the covering of her body were somehow essential to the phenomenon. Johnson proposed a test. Elizabeth should be observed lying in her bed but with the blankets removed, her entire body visible to witnesses. If the knocking occurred under these conditions, it would suggest that the child was not producing the sounds through any action of her own body. If the sounds ceased when she was fully visible, it would suggest that something about being covered was necessary for the fraud to work. Richard Parsons initially resisted this test. He argued that the ghost manifested only when Elizabeth was properly in bed, that disturbing the normal conditions might offend the spirit and cause it to cease communicating altogether. But under pressure from the committee, and with promises that the test would be conducted with propriety and concern for the child's modesty, he eventually consented. The test was conducted on the evening of June 1st with more than 20 witnesses present. Elizabeth was placed in her bed wearing her nightdress, but the blankets were not drawn over her. Candles were positioned to ensure her entire body remained visible. Observers stationed themselves around the bed, their eyes fixed on the child. Questions were posed to the spirit. The room waited in tense silence for the knocking to begin. No sounds came. The session continued for more than an hour, with repeated attempts to summon the ghost, but the walls remained silent. Elizabeth lay still and frightened under the scrutiny of so many eyes. Her father grew agitated, insisting that the unusual conditions were preventing the spirit from manifesting. But the test's implications were clear to many of those present. When the child could not move unseen beneath her covers, the knocking did not occur. Johnson proposed a second test for the following night. This time Elizabeth would be placed in bed with her blankets, but her hands would be held by observers throughout the session. If the child was producing the sounds through some manual action, knocking against the bed frame or the wall with her hands, this would be detected. Parsons agreed to this test as well, though his manner had grown defensive and hostile. The second test produced the same result as the first. With Elizabeth's hands held firmly by two reliable witnesses, no knocking occurred. The spirit, it seemed, could not manifest when the child was prevented from moving her hands freely. This finding convinced many members of Johnson's committee that they were dealing with fraud rather than supernatural phenomenon, but not all were persuaded. Some argued that the unusual conditions themselves might prevent genuine supernatural manifestation, that ghosts by their nature were capricious and might refuse to perform when subjected to such scrutiny. The debate within the committee grew heated, with believers and skeptics each interpreting the evidence according to their prior assumptions. Meanwhile, the commission appointed by the Bishop of London pursued its own investigation with different emphasis. The clergymen were less concerned with the mechanics of how the knocking was produced than with its theological implications and its effect upon the faith of ordinary Christians. They interviewed parishioners who had attended sessions on Cock Lane, assessing whether the experience had strengthened or undermined their religious beliefs. What they discovered troubled them. Many believers in the ghost had developed ideas about the afterlife that deviated from orthodox Christian teaching. Some had come to believe that the dead could return freely to the mortal world to settle earthly business, a notion contrary to church doctrine about the finality of death and the soul's immediate judgment. Others had begun seeking ways to communicate with their own departed loved ones, attempting to replicate the conditions at Cock Lane in their own homes. The ghost, whether genuine or false, was leading the faithful away from established religious understanding. The commission also examined Richard Parsons more closely, investigating his character and his circumstances. They learned of his financial difficulties, his debts, his quarrel with William Kent over the unpaid loan. They discovered that Parsons had been accepting money from visitors to witness the manifestations, that he had in effect turned his daughter into an exhibition and his home into a commercial venture. This suggested a clear motive for perpetuating the haunting regardless of its origin. When questioned about the money he had collected, Parsons insisted that he had merely accepted gifts freely offered, that visitors had insisted on paying for the trouble of admitting them, and that he had done nothing improper. But the amounts involved, while individually small, had accumulated to a sum that significantly exceeded his annual income as a parish clerk. The financial benefit to Parsons was undeniable. The Lord Mayor's inquiry proceeded along yet another path, focusing on questions of public order and civil liability. The crowds gathering nightly on Cock Lane had become a nuisance and occasionally a danger, blocking the narrow street, creating noise and disturbance that affected surrounding residents, sometimes leading to altercations between believers and skeptics. The civil authorities needed to determine whether the haunting represented a genuine matter requiring official response or a fraud that should be suppressed to restore public peace. Magistrates interviewed William Kent at length, documenting his accusations against Parsons and examining the evidence he had gathered to support his claim of conspiracy. Kent presented a detailed case. He argued that Parsons had fabricated the ghost to revenge himself for the unpaid debt and to profit from public curiosity. He suggested that the child Elizabeth had been trained to produce knocking sounds through various means, perhaps rapping her knuckles against the bed frame or using a small piece of wood concealed in her bedclothes. He noted the financial benefit that had accrued to Parsons from the haunting and the ruin that had befallen himself. But Kent could not explain how a child of 11 could maintain such an elaborate deception for months under intense scrutiny, could produce sounds loud enough to be heard throughout the house, and in the street outside could spell out complex messages through knocking that seemed to contain information she could not possess. His theory of fraud, while plausible in outline, lacked specifics about method. He could describe motive but not mechanism. The various investigations began to converge in their findings during the middle weeks of June. No conclusive evidence of fraud had been discovered, but neither had any proof of genuine supernatural manifestation emerged. The phenomenon existed. Dozens of reliable witnesses had heard the knocking, had observed its patterns, had recorded the messages it spelled out. But whether these sounds came from a ghost or from human agency remained unproven. The Reverend Stephen Aldrich, who had been involved from the early days of the haunting, proposed a final definitive test. He suggested that the spirit be asked to manifest in a location other than Elizabeth's chamber, somewhere it could not have been prepared in advance, where no possibility of concealed apparatus or trained deception could exist. If the ghost could produce knocking in an unfamiliar setting under controlled conditions, it would constitute strong evidence of supernatural origin. If it failed to manifest outside the prepared environment of Cock Lane, it would suggest human fraud limited by the constraints of its method. The proposal was accepted by all parties. A date was set, the 1st day of July, and a location chosen. The crypt of St. John's Church, where Fanny Lynes lay buried, would serve as the testing ground. Elizabeth Parsons would be brought to the church at night and placed near Fanny's vault. If the ghost was genuine, surely it would manifest most powerfully in the very place where the murdered woman's body lay. The spirit would be asked to knock upon Fanny's coffin itself, to demonstrate its presence in a manner that could not be explained by any conceivable trickery. Richard Parsons agreed to the test, though he expressed concern about subjecting his daughter to such an ordeal. Elizabeth herself said little, her face pale and drawn, her eyes reflecting fear or perhaps something else, guilt, resignation, or merely exhaustion from months of being the instrument through which others pursued their conflicts and certainties. William Kent declared that he would attend the test personally. He had been barred from entering the house on Cock Lane, but the church was public at ground, and he insisted on his right to witness what might finally prove his innocence or confirm his guilt in the eyes of London's thousands who had followed this extraordinary case. As June gave way to July, all of London seemed to hold its breath. The test in the crypt would settle the matter one way or another. Either the ghost would manifest in undeniable fashion, proving that the dead could indeed return to accuse the living, or it would fail to appear, exposing the entire affair as fraud and deception. The city waited to learn whether it had witnessed a genuine supernatural wonder or merely an elaborate human lie. The house on Cock Lane, which had been the centre of attention for half a year, now stood quiet as the focus shifted to St. John's Church. But within that house, in a small chamber where a child had lain night after night while the world debated her honesty and sanity, Elizabeth Parsons prepared herself for the final performance that would determine not just William Kent's fate, but her own. Chapter 9. The Unmasking. The first day of July arrived with oppressive heat unusual for London. The sky hung heavy and grey despite the season, and the air felt thick enough to choke. Throughout the day, word spread that the definitive test would occur that evening in the crypt of St. John's, Clerkenwell. By dusk, crowds had gathered outside the church, spilling it into the surrounding streets, hundreds of people hoping to witness or at least to be near the event that would finally resolve the mystery of the Cock Lane ghost. The church itself was opened only to those deemed necessary for the test. Members of the various investigating committees, clergy, magistrates, and a carefully selected group of witnesses representing both believers and skeptics. Richard Parsons brought Elizabeth, the child dressed plainly and walking between her parents with her head down, avoiding the eyes of the crowd that pressed close as the family made their way to the church entrance. William Kent arrived separately, accompanied by his lawyer James Franzen, and two friends who had remained loyal despite the scandal. The two men, Parsons and Kent, did not acknowledge each other, though they stood no more than 20 feet apart in the gathering outside the church. The Reverend Stephen Aldrich, as rector of St. John's, presided over the proceedings. He had spent the afternoon preparing the crypt, ensuring it was thoroughly cleaned and that candles were positioned to provide adequate light while maintaining the solemn atmosphere appropriate to such an examination. The vault where Frances Lynes lay buried had been located and marked. Her coffin rested in a stone niche in the crypt wall, sealed behind a tablet that bore her name and dates of birth and death. As darkness fell, those admitted to the test descended into the crypt. The stone stairs were narrow and worn smooth by centuries of use. The air below was cool and damp, carrying the particular smell of enclosed earth and old stone that characterizes such places. The crypt was larger than expected, its vaulted ceiling supported by thick pillars, its walls lined with niches containing the coffins of parishioners who had purchased the privilege of burial beneath the church, rather than in the churchyard outside. Candles had been arranged in a semicircle around Fanny's vault. In the centre of this space, a simple wooden chair had been placed where Elizabeth would sit during the test. The arrangement resembled a courtroom or an amphitheatre, with the child positioned where all could observe her clearly, and the ghost, if it chose to manifest, could not fail to perceive the challenge being offered. Aldrich explained the procedure to those assembled. Elizabeth would be seated in the chair near Fanny's tomb. The ghost would be addressed directly and asked to demonstrate its presence by producing knocking sounds. Specifically, it would be asked to knock upon Fanny's coffin itself, creating sound that would be audible to all present and that could not be attributed to Elizabeth's own actions. Observers would surround the child, watching her closely to ensure she made no movements that might produce sound through natural means. The test would continue for as long as necessary to allow the spirit adequate opportunity to manifest. Elizabeth was brought forward and seated in the chair. She appeared frightened, her small hands gripping the chair arms, her breathing rapid and shallow. Her mother stood nearby, ready to comfort the child if the ordeal became too distressing. Her father positioned himself where he could see both his daughter and the vault where Fanny lay buried. The assembly fell silent. Aldrich stepped forward and addressed the supposed spirit in a clear, formal voice. He called upon Frances Lynes by name, acknowledging her presence if indeed she was there, asking her to demonstrate that presence in a manner that would remove all doubt. He reminded the spirit that it had accused William Kent of murder, that this accusation had destroyed a man's reputation and livelihood, and that justice required clear proof before such charges could be accepted as truth. He implored the ghost to knock upon the coffin that contained its earthly remains, to prove beyond question and that it possessed the power and will to manifest in the physical world. The crypt waited in breathless silence. Minutes passed. No sound came except the slight rustle of clothing as observers shifted their positions, the quiet breathing of dozens of people standing motionless in the candlelit darkness. Elizabeth sat rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on Fanny's vault, her face pale as the stone around them. Aldrich repeated his invocation, speaking more urgently now. He reminded the spirit of its earlier promises, its insistent testimony delivered night after night through the knocking on Cock Lane. He challenged it to appear now, in this place so intimately connected to its earthly identity, to demonstrate the reality of the supernatural claims that had transfixed London for half a year. Still, no sound came. The silence grew oppressive, heavy with expectation, and with the gradual realization that perhaps nothing would occur, that the ghost that had been so voluble in Elizabeth's chamber had fallen mute in the crypt where its actual remains lay buried. Someone coughed. The sound echoed off the stone walls, startling in the tense quiet. Elizabeth flinched at the noise but did not move otherwise. Her mother stepped closer, placing her hand on the child's shoulder. The girl looked up at her mother, and those near enough to see her face in the candlelight noticed tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. William Kent, standing among the observers, felt something break inside his chest, whether relief or grief or some mixture of both he could not have said. The ghost's silence seemed to vindicate him, to prove through its absence that the accusations had been false, but the months of torment, the destruction of his reputation and livelihood, the loss of Fanny and their child, none of that could be undone by the spirit's failure to manifest in the crypt. Samuel Johnson, positioned near the vault where he could observe both Elizabeth and the tomb, recognised defeat. Whatever had produced the knocking on Cock Lane, whether fraud or some psychological phenomenon centred on the child, it could not be summoned at will and could not perform outside the specific environment where it had initially manifested. The implications were clear to his methodical mind. The phenomenon, whatever its nature, was not what the Parsons family had claimed it to be. Aldrich made one final attempt. He addressed the spirit not as a supernatural entity, but as a potentially troubled soul, offering prayers for its rest, asking if there was some barrier preventing its manifestation, pleading for any sign that it remained present and willing to communicate. His voice carried genuine emotion now, for he had invested months in this investigation and had hoped, perhaps more than he realized, that the supernatural claims might prove true. The silence persisted. An hour passed with no manifestation. Those present began to shift restlessly, whispering among themselves. The test clearly had failed. The ghost of Cock Lane, so insistent and communicative in the familiar confines of Elizabeth's chamber, could not or would not appear in the place where its earthly form lay buried, where its presence should have been strongest if it were genuine. Richard Parsons appeared stricken. He approached Aldrich and spoke urgently in a low voice, suggesting that perhaps the conditions were wrong, that the church setting might inhibit the spirit, that they should return to Cock Lane, where the ghost had always manifested before. But Aldrich shook his head. The test had been designed specifically to rule out fraud that depended upon preparation and familiar environment. The spirit's failure to appear in the crypt was itself a form of answer. Elizabeth was led from the crypt, still crying quietly, her small body shaking, with either cold or distress, or some deeper anguish. As she passed William Kent on the stairs, their eyes met briefly. What passed between them in that moment, guilt, apology, recognition, or merely the acknowledgement of shared suffering, no witness could say with certainty. Then the child was gone, ascending into the night with her parents, leaving behind the assembled investigators to debate what the evening's silence meant. The next morning, a more intrusive examination was proposed. If the knocking could not be produced in the crypt, perhaps it could still be explained through investigation of the methods used on Cock Lane. A group of women, led by a midwife known for her discretion and thoroughness, would examine Elizabeth's person and her bedchamber with meticulous care, searching for any apparatus or mechanism that might have been used to produce fraudulent sounds. This examination occurred on the afternoon of July 2nd in the presence of multiple witnesses. Elizabeth was taken to a private room and examined physically by the women, who searched her body and her clothing for anything that might be used to create knocking sounds. They found nothing concealed on her person. Her bedchamber on Cock Lane was then searched with equal thoroughness. The bed was dismantled, the floorboards examined, the walls tapped and probed. Still nothing was discovered that could explain the phenomenon. But one of the women, more observant than the others, noticed something peculiar. The wooden frame of Elizabeth's bed showed marks, small scratches and dents consistent with repeated impact from a hard object. She pointed these out to the other examiners. When questioned, Elizabeth at first denied any knowledge of how such marks might have been made. But under persistent, gentle questioning, with her mother sent from the room and only the sympathetic women present, the child finally broke. She had made the knocking sounds herself, she admitted through tears. Her father had taught her how, had practiced with her over many weeks until she could produce loud raps by various means, knocking her knuckles or a small wooden block against the bed frame, using the leverage of her position beneath the blankets to amplify the sound, timing her movements to coincide with questions so that the pattern seemed like intelligent response rather than random noise. She had done this night after night, had spelled out the messages her father instructed her to deliver, had maintained the deception even as it grew beyond anything they had initially imagined. The confession, once begun, poured out in a torrent. Elizabeth described how her father had harboured resentment against William Kent over the unpaid debt, how he had seen opportunity in the strange sounds that had occurred naturally during Fanny's residence in their home, sounds that might have been rats or settling timbers, but that Parsons had recognised could be attributed to supernatural cause. He had conceived the plan to transform random disturbance into deliberate haunting, to train his daughter to produce knocking on command, to use the ghost as weapon against Kent and a source of income from curious visitors. The girl described the methods in detail. The wooden block she had concealed in her bedclothes, smooth and hard, perfect for striking against the bed frame. The way she had learned to move beneath the blankets without visible motion, to position her body so that impacts were transmitted through the bed into the walls and floor. The signals her father had taught her, subtle gestures that told her when to knock and how many times, what patterns to produce to spell out the predetermined messages. She had not understood fully what she was doing at first. She had thought it was a game, a trick they were playing. But as the crowds had grown, as the accusations against Kent had become serious, as important men had come to investigate and debate, she had realised the magnitude of the deception, but had not known how to stop it. She was frightened of her father, frightened of the consequences of confession, frightened of disappointing those who believed in the ghost. So she had continued, night after night, producing the knocking that had convinced thousands and destroyed William Kent's life. The confession was documented carefully by the witnesses present. Elizabeth signed it with her mark, for her hand was too unsteady to write properly. The women who had examined her felt pity for the child, recognising that she had been used cruelly by her father and by circumstances beyond her control. But pity could not undo the fact that fraud had been committed, that London had been deceived, and that an innocent man had been gravely harmed. When Richard Parsons learned of his daughter's confession, he denied everything. He insisted that Elizabeth had been coerced, that the women had frightened or tricked her into making false statements, that the ghost was genuine and would return to prove itself once the current persecution ended. But his protestations carried no weight. The child's detailed description of methods, the physical evidence of marks on the bed frame, and the ghost's failure to manifest in the crypt all combined to make the case for fraud overwhelming. Within days, warrants were issued for Richard Parsons' arrest on charges of conspiracy to defame. He was taken into custody and brought before the magistrate, where the evidence against him was presented in formal proceeding. The case attracted enormous attention, for it represented not merely a criminal prosecution, but the public unmasking of a deception that had captivated an entire city. The trial of Richard Parsons would wait for the court calendar, but in the meantime the story of the Cock Lane ghost transformed from mystery to scandal. The newspapers that had reported breathlessly on the supernatural manifestations now dissected the fraud in exhaustive detail. Those who had believed in the ghost felt foolish and angry at having been deceived. Those who had always been sceptical enjoyed vindication. And William Kent, though his reputation remained damaged perhaps beyond repair, could at least stop defending himself against accusations delivered by the dead. Elizabeth Parsons, the child who had been the instrument of fraud and the victim of her father's manipulation, disappeared from the public view. What she thought about the months she had spent as a false medium, what scars the experience left upon her, would remain largely unknown. She had been used and then discarded by a story that had needed her to exist, but had no further use for her once the truth emerged. The house on Cock Lane returned to obscurity, though it would carry its reputation for years. The crypt of St. John's Church received no more midnight visitors seeking to commune with spirits, and Frances Lynes remained in her tomb, her name forever associated not with her actual life and death, but with the false ghost that had spoken in her name, making accusations she herself might never have made, serving purposes she could not have intended. The Cock Lane ghost had been unmasked, but the damage it had done to reputations, to lives, to the boundary between truth and deception would persist long after the knocking ceased. Chapter 10. The Silence That Followed. The trial of Richard Parsons began in early July at the Court of King's Bench before Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. The courtroom was crowded with spectators who had followed the Cock Lane ghost case from its sensational beginnings through its recent exposure as fraud. They came not to learn the outcome, the verdict seemed predetermined by Elizabeth's confession, but to witness the final act of a drama that had occupied London's attention for the better part of a year. The charges against Parsons were specific. He stood accused of conspiracy to defame William Kent, of fraud in accepting money under false pretenses from visitors who had paid to witness what they believed were genuine supernatural manifestations, and of corrupting his own daughter by training her to participate in the deception. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. Elizabeth's signed confession was entered into evidence. The marks on her bed frame were documented. Witnesses testified to the money Parsons had collected, and to his obvious control over the knocking's occurrence, how it manifested only when he was present, only in his house, only under conditions he could manage. Parsons mounted little defence. His lawyer argued that his client had been as deceived as anyone by phenomena he did not create and could not control. He suggested that Elizabeth's confession had been coerced, that the child was now lying to escape punishment, or because she had been frightened by the examining women. But these arguments collapsed under scrutiny. Too many witnesses had observed too many suspicious patterns. The ghost's failure to manifest in the church crypt, his dependence on specific conditions that allowed the child to move unseen beneath her blankets, the convenient details of its testimony that served Parsons' grudge against Kent, all of it pointed unmistakably to deliberate fraud. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Lord Mansfield, in pronouncing sentence, spoke at length about the serious nature of Parsons' offences. He had not merely perpetrated a fraud for financial gain. He had manipulated the religious beliefs and supernatural fears of thousands. He had corrupted his own child, robbing her of innocence and teaching her to deceive. Most seriously, he had used the pretense of supernatural testimony to destroy the reputation and livelihood of an innocent man, effectively condemning William Kent without trial or due process, through accusations that could not be answered or refuted by normal means. The sentence reflected the gravity of these offences. Parsons was condemned to stand in the pillory on 3 separate occasions, at the end of Cock Lane itself, at the Royal Exchange where Kent had worked before the scandal destroyed his position, and at Smithfield Market. After the pillory, he would serve 2 years' imprisonment and pay a fine he could not afford. His life, like Kent's, had been destroyed by the ghost, though in Parsons' case the destruction was self-inflicted, the inevitable consequence of a scheme that had grown far beyond his ability to control it. The first pillory was scheduled for July 10th on Cock Lane itself. A crowd gathered to witness Parsons' humiliation, many of them neighbours who had believed in the ghost and now felt betrayed by his deception. The pillory was a brutal punishment, exposing the condemned to public abuse and to whatever missiles the crowd chose to throw. Parsons stood with his head and hands locked in the wooden frame, his face already bloodied by rotten vegetables and small stones, while the neighbourhood he had once hoped to profit from expressed its collective rage at having been made foolish. William Kent did not attend the pillory. He had achieved legal vindication, but it brought him little satisfaction. His position at the Exchange was permanently lost. His reputation, though no longer stained by accusations of murder, remained associated with scandal and supernatural controversy. The woman he had loved was still dead. The child they had created together was still buried, and the months of torment he had endured could not be undone by Parsons's punishment. Kent withdrew from public life after the trial, taking modest lodgings in an unfashionable quarter and seeking employment where his name would not be recognised. He lived quietly, working as a clerk in various counting houses, never staying long in one position, gradually fading from the notice of a city that had briefly made him the central figure in its most sensational story. He never remarried. He never spoke publicly about Frances Lynes or about the ghost that had accused him in her name. In time he would die unmourned and largely forgotten. One more life broken by events that seemed too strange to be entirely believed even by those who had witnessed them. Elizabeth Parsons suffered perhaps most cruelly of all those caught up in the affair. She had been used as an instrument of fraud by her father, had been trained to deceive from an age too young to understand the implications of what she was doing, and had then been exposed and vilified when the truth emerged. Her confession had destroyed her father and confirmed the fraud, but it had not brought her sympathy or forgiveness from most who learned her story. The child was sent to live with relatives in the country, removed from London where her name and face were too well known. What became of her in later years remains obscure. She married eventually, taking a name that concealed her identity. She bore children and lived into middle age, but she never escaped entirely from the shadow of the Cock Lane ghost. Those who knew her history regarded her with suspicion or pity, uncertain whether she had been victim or accomplice, whether she deserved compassion or condemnation. Mrs. Parsons, who had maintained silence throughout the investigation and trial, found herself alone. Her husband was in prison. Her daughter was gone. The house on Cock Lane, which had briefly been the most famous address in London, was now merely infamous. She remained there initially, unable to afford other lodging, enduring the stares and whispers of neighbours who had once crowded into her home to witness wonders but now avoided her as if fraud might be contagious. Eventually she too left Cock Lane, finding work as a domestic servant in a household that either did not know or did not care about her connection to the scandal. She survived into old age in obscurity, her husband's imprisonment and death occurring while she laboured in other people's houses, cleaning other people's property, her own home and family destroyed by the ghost that had never existed. The broader cultural impact of the Cock Lane ghost case reverberated through Georgian society for years. The exposure of the fraud strengthened the hand of skeptics and rationalists who argued that supernatural claims should always be subjected to rigorous empirical examination. The case became a touchstone in debates about evidence and credulity, cited by those who insisted that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. Samuel Johnson wrote about the case in terms that mixed disappointment with satisfaction. He had hoped, perhaps, to witness genuine supernatural manifestation, to find evidence that the boundary between life and death was not absolute. But his commitment to truth and rational inquiry had compelled him to pursue investigation even when it led to mundane explanation rather than marvel. The case, he concluded, demonstrated both the human hunger for wonders and the importance of not allowing that hunger to overwhelm critical judgment. The Church responded with renewed emphasis on orthodox teaching about death and resurrection. The notion that the dead could return to communicate with the living was condemned as contrary to Scripture and to the revealed truth about the soul's immediate judgment after death. Ministers preached against the dangers of seeking intercourse with spirits, warning that such attempts invited demonic deception, even when human fraud was not involved. The legal profession gained from the case a precedent regarding evidence and testimony. The principle was established that claims of supernatural agency, however widely believed, could not substitute for physical evidence and reliable witness testimony in criminal proceedings. William Kent could not have been convicted of murder based solely on the ghost's accusations, even if the ghost had been genuine. This principle would shape English law's approach to similar cases in subsequent decades. The house on Cock Lane itself remained a curiosity and a cautionary tale. New tenants eventually moved into the upper chambers where Elizabeth had produced her fraudulent knocking, though the rooms commanded lower rent than they had before the scandal. Visitors still occasionally came to see where the famous haunting had occurred, though they came now as tourists viewing a site of historical interest rather than as believers hoping to commune with spirits. Cock Lane had been, for most of its history, an unremarkable street in an unremarkable parish. For a brief period in 1761 and 62, it had been the most discussed location in London, drawing thousands who sought either supernatural encounter or scandal's entertainment. When the truth emerged and the crowds departed, it returned to obscurity, just another narrow lane where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, distinguished only by its association with fraud and credulity, and the very human tendency to believe in marvels. Frances Lynes remained in her tomb at St. John's, Clerkenwell, her actual story largely forgotten beneath the false narrative that had been constructed in her name. She had been a young woman who loved unwisely, who died tragically in childbirth like thousands of others in that era, whose life was cut short before she could discover what she might have become. The ghost that spoke in her name had accused and condemned, but it had not truly been her voice. What she herself would have said about William Kent, about her death, about the child she lost, these questions remained unanswered and unanswerable. The Cock Lane ghost became a phrase in the language, shorthand for fraud masquerading as supernatural phenomenon, for credulity overcome by investigation, for the human capacity to deceive and to be deceived. It entered the literature and the historical record as example and warning, cited in encyclopedias and histories, referenced in debates about evidence and belief. But beyond the legal and cultural consequences, beyond the lessons learned and precedents established, the case left behind broken lives and unresolved sorrows. William Kent's reputation was destroyed, though he was innocent. Richard Parsons' life ended in prison for a scheme that brought him nothing but ruin. Elizabeth Parsons lost her childhood and lived ever after with guilt and shame for deception she'd been too young to refuse. And Frances Lynes, who had done nothing except die, became forever associated not with her actual life, but with the false ghost that had stolen her identity and perverted her memory. The knocking on Cock Lane had ceased on that July night in the church crypt when the ghost failed to manifest. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of closure, but the empty silence of questions left unanswered and damage left unrepaired. The truth had been established. There had been no ghost, only fraud. But truth did not heal the wounds that deception had inflicted. London moved on to other scandals and wonders, as cities always do. The crowds that had pressed close to the narrow house on Cock Lane found new entertainments, new mysteries to debate in coffee houses and drawing rooms. The newspapers that had chronicled every development in the haunting turned their attention to wars and politics and royal gossip. But for those who had been caught in the ghost's orbit, for Kent and Parsons and Elizabeth, and all the others whose lives had intersected with that strange moment when London convinced itself that the dead could speak, there was no moving on. They carried the experience with them for the rest of their days, the memory of a time when supernatural accusation had seemed more credible than human testimony, where knocking in the walls had been heard as the voice of justice crying out from beyond the grave. And so the Cock Lane ghost passed into history, leaving behind it a silence more profound than any sound, a darkness deeper than any that had existed before those first mysterious scratchings had been heard in the winter of 1761. The candles had burned low, the chamber had fallen silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.